keep talking for 3 minutes. We're, just waiting for everyone to come in.
You shoved it? Oh, did I have it in?
I don't think so. No, put it in after if you like today.
It's fine.
Do it twice. Should we go for it?
What time is it? So where are we today? The London Reactor. Have you used one like this before?
Yeah. Okay. And you're charging it at the back, weren't you? Yeah. Okay, I think we'll look to make a start here. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along today. Hopefully you'll have found this through Twitter or through the Evolve conference or through the meetup. The idea is that kind of over the course of these 2 days, we're doing a little piece of everything to do with Teams. So, depending on where you're at in your journey of looking at Teams, whether you've got Teams up and running, whether you're in pilot, whether you're just looking at it, whether it's the telephony angle that you're interested in or more the collaboration space. Hopefully over the course of these 2 days, we're going to cover something that you need. And if not, at the end of each day at the 4 p.m. slots, we've got kind of an open Q&A as everyone fades away. Feel free to stick around and ask questions. We've got quite a few of us here do this for a living, so treat it like an hour's slice of free consultancy if you want to. The idea with this first session today is we're going to do a little bit of an overview of where Teams is today, what it is, how it works, some of the things you need to think about when you're going to deploy it. Then we're going to roll into Brian. Where's Brian? He might be in the section out the back, talking about getting your users ready for going to Teams. Then Steve, after lunch, is going to talk about Exchange and Skype. Back to Brian for data protection and compliance for Teams, so kind of more on the collaboration aspect, your data, your documents, what happens in there. Day two is over to me to start with calling in Teams. There's several different ways you can look at telephony with Teams, so we'll cover how you license that, some of the considerations, some of the media flows. That'll probably err on a little bit more of the technical side when we're talking about data flows and things to worry about, I guess. And then Jason's going to run us through how to look after quality in your deployment. We've got Tom Morgan, who's a Teams superstar developer, probably an appropriate title, coming to talk to us about Teams applications, but it's aimed at people who are not developers, because kind of part of the whole idea with Teams is things like Power Apps and Flow. There's a lot of stuff you can do to augment your Teams deployment without having to be super in the detail of coding and programming. And then back over to Jason to talk about kind of wrapping everything up and, if Teams is something that is ticking your boxes, how to successfully drive usage and get people on board with it. And then again, back into the open Q&A. And then also it's worth mentioning that this is our first Evolve on Tour. This is an offshoot of the Evolve conference that we run once a year up at the National Conference Centre, which is part of the National Motorcycle Museum near Birmingham/Coventry. How many people have been to that before? It used to be called UC Day. Yeah, okay, fair few. So that this year is a little bit later in the year, that's in October. But if you keep an eye on the evolveconf.co.uk website, we're going to have registrations opening up soon. That's a free single-day event. Difference between what we're doing today is this is all focused around Teams. The Evolve conference has 3 or 4 different tracks catering to different needs. So things like there was an on-prem server track, there was an Azure track, there's an Office 365 track, there's a Teams/collaboration track. So hopefully, again, there's a little bit of something for everyone with that. The other thing as well with that is, it's made possible through our sponsorship, but there are no sponsor sessions. It's all people can submit to talk about any topic that they want, and then we have a board that kind of anonymously go through and pick those sessions. So if anyone in this room fancies that there's something they want to talk about or stand up and share at something like Evolve Conference, you're more than welcome to submit a session and fill in what you want to talk about and potentially get picked out of the hat. So before I turn over to Steve, I should probably give an introduction to us three, actually. So my name's Ben, this is Steve, this is Jason. I work for a company that does consultancy around Teams and the communication side.
I'm an MVP for Exchange and Microsoft Teams, and I focus on the whole of Office 365 on a day-to-day basis, but I also get deep into some of the user adoption side of Microsoft Teams, all the way through to still doing Exchange hybrid deployments, so across the whole of Office 365.
And Jason Wynn, I'm Office Apps and Services MVP, specializing in Teams, Skype for Business, collaboration, integration, telephony. How do we get the most out of our existing infrastructure? How do we get the most out of our existing telepresence units? We pull all that together, and that's what I do.
So out of the people here today, how many people would say you are using Teams in production? Quite a few. And how many of that is for telephony as well as for the collaboration aspects? Okay, how many people have got Teams in pilots? And how many people know about it but haven't really found or figured out why or what they want to do with it? Okay, so a real kind of mix. I mean, again, the idea with today is hopefully we're pitching across quite a broad spectrum, but if there's stuff that we're not covering or you've got questions, please do chip in. We've got a microphone in a throwy box, and I'm looking forward to trying to break some laptops and spill some water with that. So please just chip in as we go. And then, Steve.
Yeah, so as Ben says, we're not expecting you to be a Teams expert, and we're not going to go deep diving into the most technical bits at the beginning of today. So if you're just starting out on that Teams journey, then hopefully we've got something for you. And tomorrow in the sessions that Ben and Jason are presenting, I'll learn a lot myself because I'm not an expert in the whole of this. And I think as you get to know Teams, as you learn more about it, you'll realise that actually it's one of those products where even if you knew everything about it today, in 3 weeks' time, there'd be something new to learn, which makes it interesting for us because there's always something new and there's always something to learn. So we're going to start off really at the basics, where if you've never used Microsoft Teams before, or you're just starting out and figuring out where it fits, it's another Office 365 product in the suite, where does it fit? How does it interact with all those products? I'm going to start with that, then look at where it came from as well, a bit about its history, and then in this session, talk a little bit more about some of the newer things that are coming down the line. So Microsoft Teams fits inside the whole of the Office 365 suite, and there's lots and lots of different products. And the biggest problem I have is if I'm going to go and talk to people who are going to use Office 365, there's just too much in there. And we've got the Office suite, I know that's taking up about a quarter of this here, but we've got all these products like Planner, Stream, Power BI, Forms, Sway, Power Apps, and Flow. And if you go to an average person in the business and say, I've got Office 365, how do you fancy using 20 different products? And this isn't comprehensive, there's a few more on top of this as well. Then they're really going to be taken aback because there's a lot in there to try and consume and work out where it fits. But for us, Teams often fits as the gateway to a lot of other services in Office 365, almost like the drug that gets them hooked. And it's a service that fits into all of these other services as well, because if you're using Teams as the dashboard to Office 365, then you're going to be able to access all of your files in SharePoint. You'll record your meetings, they'll go into Stream, you'll be able to attach planner tasks, you'll be able to create and publish forms out using Microsoft Forms, build flows that automate business processes. We've got lots of different places. Skype for Business, you do your calling, it can even replace your phone system. So we've got lots of places that Microsoft Teams opens the door to. It's almost like a front door to services. Or one of my colleagues said it sort of stands on the shoulders of giants. Microsoft have built all these great services that they deliver as part of Office 365. But this is really that one place where we can say, instead of giving you lots and lots more tools to use, here's one tool that's going to help replace lots of different things. And I think that's quite useful because in the past, when we've used Office 365 prior to Yammer, the biggest challenge I've always seen is people saying this is just yet another tool. I had Outlook, it was a mess. I had too many emails to manage. But now you give me Yammer, that's yet another place to look at. Skype for Business, now everyone's going to see whether I'm busy or I'm at my desk or not. And then we start layering on tools after that. SharePoint, for one, until Teams came along, really struggled with adoption, getting people to use it. Whereas now the adoption from Microsoft's perspective has shot straight up because people do want to use it, but they're using it as part of Teams. The other bits around it work well as well, like the OneDrive client. And taking this from Microsoft's slide, the carefully gets cut through in the middle there. We've got this big question where people say, what tool do I use? Because lots of the documentation and lots of articles about Teams and Slack and tools like that say it's going to replace email. And people are just going to move all of that stuff that they get every day over into a tool like Teams. And really, that's not compelling for most people, because it just means it's moving a load of rubbish from one place to another. And sometimes that'll be better because there'll be more commentary on it, a history of that information, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And Microsoft respect this when we're looking at how it should be used. The email will still be there because it's standards-based. It works whatever system you're on. You could be using an old email account from an ISP, you could be using Google, Yahoo, a server running at another business, and you can still email people. It just works with everything. On the right-hand side here, we've got Yammer. And Yammer is the tool that's used for open collaboration. So we don't see Yammer being completely displaced by Microsoft Teams. And larger organizations that really want to try and get pockets of silos of people who aren't collaborating or sharing information to share across those boundaries, we want them to use a tool like Yammer to be able to break down the walls. And when we're doing things like user research, we're trying to understand what people are trying to get out of the tools that they're having, or the problems that they have today in the business that they work, then one of the common things people will say in larger organizations is, I can't find the right people to help me with things. I feel like we've got a pocket of innovation in this part of the business, and there's another part of the business somewhere else. They're probably doing the same thing as us. We need to break down the rules. But if we don't adopt a tool like Yammer properly, then we have a lot of problems, because you've got to change the culture of a business, and you've got to convince them that actually it's going to be better for them if they share more and they're more open with their colleagues. And if you're a salesperson in an organization and you get rewarded for keeping all that knowledge to yourself, or your team gets rewarded, you're being pitted against other teams, then there's not a lot of motivation to change. So Yammer is always a lot harder to get people to adopt. Teams fits into this inner loop where actually we are trying to collaborate already in the kind of way that Teams enables, where people are trying to work closely as a team, get stuff done, and that's where Teams fits in. It's that inner loop of communications where we're trying to build something very, very quickly. I heard quite a good analogy the other day where Teams might be the place where you bake the cake, and Yammer might be the place where you share it with others. And that makes a lot of sense. That's where we get stuff done. You know, all the stuff I work on a day-to-day basis should really happen in Teams, unless I'm then sharing either with the rest of the business or I'm trying to share outside the business and they've not got access to those tools. And it's seen as that place where we've got access to different parts of the service. So you won't just use it as your calling solution. It won't be your desk phone. If you're using Teams and it is literally replacing Skype for Business or your desk phone today, then that's not necessarily the best way to use the tool, because that's just using one piece of it. And it doesn't provide a lot more value than just using something like Skype for Business or just giving people mobile phones. What we do want it to be able to do is be a place where people can get access to their files and their Teams files, and then they can work alongside them. Because without using a tool like Teams as the glue, you're relying on commenting on documents, emails being sent out to say, I've updated the document, or without Office 365 in general, sending around copies of different documents and having 15 different versions, all stored with different names. And we want to be able to connect into those other services as well. And that's where we see a lot of the glue happening. So the concept of Teams is that we've got access to files. We've got access to all of our meetings on a day-to-day basis. We've got our chat where we might be talking to the people we work really closely with, whether that's inside or outside our team, in a one-to-one or one-to-many basis. And then we've got all these other different integrations to all those other services. So I'll drop out of this and give you a quick demo.
Is it worth just saying as well that rings diagram, there's been many different versions of that Microsoft produce, sort of showing someone starting their day and they're on the train, so they do something on their mobile, and then they get to the office, they do something on the desk, and I guess there's many different ways of slicing which tool you want to use when, and Teams is kind of the broadest platform that sits across the most different scenarios, but there's not necessarily a right place and a wrong place to do something. It's just what works best for your organization.
Yeah, and when we work that way, you don't want people to use the tools in different ways either. So it shouldn't be up to just the individual, because if I say, well, I'm going to use Teams and I'm going to set up a team with the people I work closely with, and then somebody else in my team says, actually, I want to do it on Yammer, it's not going to work. We need to convince the organization. So when it comes to how you adopt it, and we'll talk much more about that tomorrow in Jason's session tomorrow afternoon, then what we want to do is make sure that you've got executive level support, sponsorship for the project, and we want to make sure that those line managers, when I talk to the customers I work with, and you're listening to what people want from the business, they know full well that if everybody doesn't use these tools, it's not going to work for them. And this hopefully should be obvious to you, but it is allowing you to use this tool in the way that makes sense. So if I'm working on this on the desktop, I leave the office, I could even be halfway through a call, then I should be able to jump on that call from the Teams client on the mobile device. I'll continue my chats. I don't have to switch mediums. I don't have to switch to email when I leave. I don't have to start a new conversation on WhatsApp. I just continue where I dropped off. So Teams itself, if you've never used it before, is split into our activity feed that tells us the most recent things that have happened. And you'll see here I've got a reply from one of my integrations from Jira posting into my message. I've got a message that was blocked. This was another demo I did the other day. I tried to send my daughter my national insurance number, as you do, and Teams DLP blocked it. And that's my general activity, what's happening across both my individual feed, but also across all of the notifications I get. I've got my chat, and this is where it replaces what I might do with Skype for Business for one-to-one and one-to-many chats, where I randomly chat to Lady Gaga. I wish I'd never created those test accounts.
I've got blocked again, Steve. There's something going on.
Oh yeah, DLP. You can watch my YouTube video where I made this demo a few weeks ago. We can talk to bots, for example, approvals. This is an approval example where Microsoft Flow is asking me to approve a request that's came through. It's not just those Skype for Business messages, and the day-to-day chats as well, where I might be sending the location I'm at, saying, come and meet me here. Did you get this message on your phone? No, of course you didn't, because you don't check your messages. She wanted to come along today, actually, because it's the summer holidays already. Can you believe it? And then we've got Teams itself. And the Teams tab is where we've got the teams themselves, which have members and owners. Members can contribute to Teams. We can set their permissions for what they can do. Members can, if you want, add channels themselves, add tabs that give us access to files, third-party applications, and built-in applications as well. And then we've got the Meetings tab. And the Meetings tab is where we'll be able to access all of our ongoing meetings. This is the view into our Outlook calendar. So if we close Outlook through the day, we can be sure that if we've got a meeting coming up that we need to join, then we'll get a notification from Teams itself. And in the Calling tab, if it's replacing your desk phone, then it might be that it is your desk phone, it's sitting on your desk with a similar interface to this, but it's also the place that you'll make those Skype for Business type calls as well. And then we've got access to some of our applications as well. So I've got access to my OneDrive itself. I've got access to my recent documents, everything I've been working on. And then I've got access to all my other integrations where I've added applications into Microsoft Teams, and I access those as first-party applications outside of the team itself. So if I want to access my personal OneNote, this is where I'll go. And the store is where I'm able to access all of my third-party applications as well. So these are third parties that have built applications that work within Microsoft Teams. And these are mostly built by the vendors themselves. Some of those are built by Microsoft on their behalf. But this is really where, if you've got people that are using tools like Slack today, or looking for how Teams can be more useful than just IM and chat, then you'll find that you've got all of the integrations here available for most of the applications you'll have. So I was working with an organization the other day. They've fully adopted Teams. They're a development company. They've got mature DevOps teams. They use Jira, Confluence for most of what they do on a day-to-day basis. But as I walk around the office, you could see they've got Confluence on one screen, and then they've got Teams on the other screen. And really what they could be doing, and they didn't realize the extent of the integration, was bringing those tools into the service itself, where if they want to, they can search. Here we go. If I search Confluence, then you've got access, like, for example, the bot itself, to go and search and access documents within that third-party service. You get a 7-day subscription. And mine has unfortunately expired for Confluence for my demo. But here we've got all of these different applications that we'll bring in. And I'll show you a couple of these here. So I'll start in the All About 365 podcast. So this is the one that Jason and I do. If you've ever listened to it, you can get it on iTunes, Spotify, and all good podcast stores. And we organise what we do on these using Microsoft Teams. This is where it all happens. And I'm working with a guest. Jason is outside of my tenant, but we use it to get stuff done. And you can see within the podcast that we recorded with Lev Nagy the other day, we even used it to say, we're 30 minutes in, we need to wrap up the podcast. But not only did we make the podcast in it, we read it as we're going through, we read our outline script. We can also use it to plan the episodes. I click on the plan tab, I've got access to Microsoft Planner here. We can see all the recordings that we're planning to make. It's got access to the files within our teams, our checklist for what we need to do, who's going to do what, and we can bring in data from things like Power BI dashboards, and we can see the episode plays, and I'm terrible at Power BI, but with a few drag and drop, I brought in the data to show what our most popular episodes are, so we can see in real time what that looks like, and bring in all sorts of different data from those different kind of applications. And then in other types of teams, we might not be just using it for that chat where we're getting stuff done, but we also might use it as the place where we automate tasks as well. So if I said to someone, you know what we could do? We could have a SharePoint list. We could build a Power App built on it. Then we'll automate things and get email approval notifications over Microsoft Flow. Then people go, well, that's a lot of different tools to give people. But using Microsoft Teams, then that simple line of business process that we want to automate, we can build inside Microsoft Teams itself. And here, for example, and you'll see a guide online fairly soon if you want to build your own. We've used Microsoft Flow to perform the approvals process for documents. And in this, from a user perspective, what this is doing is it's automatically creating Word documents that are populated with a whole load of information. And if I'm a user, then I might go into this tab and it'll give me access to that SharePoint list, and I can press new, it'll bring up a Power App from there, and I'll use the Power App to fill in information, then that'll send an approval to a manager, they'll read the information that I've brought into the Power App, and then it'll use Microsoft Flow in the background to automate the creation of a document, let everybody in our team know that that's happened, and here I've created an adaptive card to show what that's going to look like. So I'm building a business process, I'm automating a complicated process that I use day to day. But from a user perspective, it's just one of those things that Teams does for me. Even though it's using SharePoint, it's using Power Apps, it's using Microsoft Flow, and then it's using all of that as the notification engine, where if I'm a manager, then I might go in and Flow will ask me to approve or deny things. It all happens within the one client. So that's Teams in a nutshell. We've got access to all of our meetings. We've got access to IM chat, but we've also got access to not only our files, but also the place where we can access all of those other services inside Office 365. So Ben is now going to talk a bit more about the history of Microsoft Teams. Where did it come from? And then Jason's going to talk a bit more about where's it going.
Yeah, so this, as I mentioned at the beginning, my background is on the Skype for Business side. So I thought to try and get rid of some of these amazing Teams bottle squeegee holder things. Does anyone fancy having a stab at taking us from Live Communication Server 2003 through to Teams on the Microsoft product roadmap? Go on, I know one or two of you can. Go on then, go for it. What's next?
Live Communication Server 2005.
And then?
Office Communication Server 2007.
And then?
Office Communication Server 2007 R2.
That's true. This is not my slide.
Blame me, I made the slide.
Link Server 2013.
Yep.
Link Server 2013.
Yep.
Skype for Business 2015.
Yep.
Teams / Skype for Business Server 2019.
There we go. So every 2 generations, we rename the product. Well done, sir. Yeah, so the idea with this is just kind of showing that Teams, particularly from a communications point of view, this is not a new product. Teams is, as Steve said, built on the shoulders of all these other things. So the lessons that Microsoft learned way back in 2003, the stuff that they did in 2007 R2, which is where OCS started being able to replace your PBX, all the stuff through Link Server 2013 and Skype for Business, where many, many businesses actually ran their entire telephony platform on Skype for Business, that stuff feeds through into Teams. Now, I'm sure some of you that will have looked at Teams will be sat there thinking, well, Skype used to do this and Teams doesn't do that. We've got to bear in mind that Teams is architected very, very differently to Skype for Business. Skype for Business was you deployed this product, you ran it on your servers, you ran it in your data center, and you were the people who were responsible for that. Teams, sitting in Office 365, is running across many, many different geographies, many, many different data centers around the world. It has to be architected differently to support some of that stuff. And to make sure that what you're doing in your tenant doesn't impact anyone else in their tenant. One of the things I'm going to talk about in my telephony session first thing tomorrow is some of the stuff about what happens in a conferencing scenario. In the on-prem world, you knew that when you had a conference, your users signed in, it went to that server pool because that was their home and that's where the conference ran from. In the Teams world, that's very different because there are these 3 different geographies and stuff happens in a different way. Just quickly on that theme, I thought of Skype versus Teams. It was worth just kind of covering off some of the key points between the two. That Skype for Business used to be about instant messages. It was that person was there, you could see they were available, you could message them, they would respond. Teams, that's different. Teams is chat. You might think that that's an equivalent, but actually it's not. In Teams, I can see if someone's there, I can see if they're not there, but I could still maybe choose to message them in the same way that when someone is out of office, you might still choose to email them. So whereas in Skype for Business, generally if someone wasn't green, I wouldn't IM them. In Teams, I might still choose to IM them anyway, because I know that they will pick that up in their own time. Skype for Business used to have this notion that it was a single client and you could escalate through everything and go into a conference. Teams does all of that escalation into a conference and more because it has all of those collaboration elements that Steve was talking about in the same client as well. On the collaboration side, Skype was desktop share, PowerPoint, whiteboard. On Teams, it goes off the bottom of the list there. There's just so many different things that you can do with it. But one of the challenges in terms of dealing with Teams is this notion of that it is always updating, that there's always new stuff coming into the product. There's always things that are changing. For us working in IT back in the day, the good old days maybe, I don't know, it used to be that you had a product release. You had your Skype for Business server 2015, it got released. You had a normal support period, and then you had an extended support period. And you would choose as an organization whether when a new product came out that you would upgrade to that. There was something that you wanted that product now did that it didn't do before. And you would go through the process of doing your upgrades, doing your planning, and you'd migrate your users, and then boom, you'd be on this platform. Or maybe you would choose to wait, and you'd skip a version, and you'd go ahead to here. This stuff is changing in Microsoft, particularly with 365 now. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Office 365 Pro Plus model where you have this notion of different channels that you put your users into. They've renamed them recently, but the ones that stick in my mind are you've got first release and deferred release and client left, right to center release, channel 1, 2, 3. They've got these different names. You pick which channel you want to put your users into, and that dictates whether you're behind the curve or ahead of the curve in terms of feature sets coming through. And that in itself can be a challenge to some organizations in terms of making sure documentation is correct or making sure that support know what particular icon is where for someone to click on when they ring in with a problem. Unfortunately, Teams kind of makes that a little bit worse. Teams is constantly updating. It is always going through this cycle that there is something being updated or being pushed out. And sometimes you have control over those features. Sometimes with some PowerShell, you can, in a client policy or an update, you can block whatever it is. So maybe third-party apps, you don't want to do something with them, so you can restrict what third-party apps there are. But there's also minor changes. So things like when you're in a Teams meeting, they recently changed the UI. It used to be that you had the meeting screen and you had icons down the side. They've moved everything so that all the iconography is now at the bottom of the screen. That's great, because from a UI point of view, it now makes sense. It looks better, everything's in one place. But the documentation you wrote 3 months ago when you deployed Teams and gave it to your users is now wrong and out of date. So there is this element that you have to kind of prep users for a little bit more fluidity, that just what they've been trained or shown isn't necessarily what they will see or what they will have today. In terms of how Teams releases features, Teams has this notion of rings. So your tenant and your users sit in different rings. So when Microsoft develop a feature, generally it will start out life in ring 0, which is the Microsoft Dev environment. Features will then graduate or radiate outwards all the way through to ring 4, which is general availability. So that's when something has been announced by Microsoft and you see it, coming through in your tenant, that will generally be that feature has reached through to ring 4. Then there's these different ones that you go through. If you're part of TAP, is anyone part of TAP for Teams? Yeah, so your tenant will be sat in ring 3. So all the users in your organization, your tenant will have been whitelisted and will have been put through into ring 3. But as part of TAP, you have some users who are early adopters. So your user accounts, and the way you do it is you give Microsoft the specific GUID of your account into a team, and then they go and change your user into ring 1.5. So you can have this scenario where even your entire organization, different users are at different levels of feature sets coming through in the client. So things like the client on my laptop, my laptop is in ring 1.5. So my user, I'll have something appear in my client that I can do that when I'm talking to one of my project managers on a conference call, he doesn't have and he doesn't do. It boggles my mind how Microsoft are getting through developing all of this stuff, how making sure that me on 1.5 can interop with ring 3 and then do stuff with people on public on ring 4. And generally, I don't know if your experience is the same, but that stuff is working pretty smoothly. The number of times I've had interop issues between rings and things is pretty low. The other interesting thing is there's ring 3.9, which is pretty much what Microsoft's on. So if you're ever in a meeting with Microsoft and they've but my Teams client does that, that's generally because they're on ring 3.9, which is just before release, and they don't necessarily know it, particularly if they're on the sales side of the org. The other interesting thing with TAP is TAP used to be one big program. So you were part of the Exchange TAP, and you got access to the next version of Exchange. You were part of Skype, you got access to the Skype for Business previews, whatever it was. With Teams, the TAPs are actually generally feature specific. So you can be on a TAP for a particular feature, which might be large user conferences, or it might be a particular meeting device interop scenario. So you can be in on that feature, but not in on another, and you can kind of pick and choose. So again, if you are an organization that's in TAP or interested in TAP, just be aware that it's not one giant program that you get into for Teams. There are many, many different things coming through at the same time. And this rings thing also explains why when you see on tech communities, for example, that something has been released or something is coming out in preview, it takes a long time for some of these things to kind of ripple out and arrive at all of the tenants around the world. Which actually is another point just worth jumping to if I hop forward. So also, there's this element of geographies. So Teams is running out of certain data centers around the world. So again, just because a feature has reached ring 4 and has become generally available, generally that will start rolling out on the US data centers, then come over to Europe and then go through the Asia Pac data centers. So again, if you've got users or your tenant is homed in a different location, you might have a little bit of a wait or a period of time before something becomes available to you. One of the things I get asked semi-frequently, which unfortunately I don't have a good answer for, is, well, how am I supposed to be aware of when something's available, or how am I meant to keep on top of what is coming out? I don't know if you guys have a good answer. I don't particularly have one beyond you need to keep an eye on these 3 places, which is the Microsoft 365 roadmap. That is a web service that Microsoft published that you can go to and consume either via RSS or just as via the web. Unfortunately, they are getting better at this, but tech communities will quite often have a new feature posted in it before it appears on the roadmap and before it gets flagged as release, and the community blogs. So it's generally, if you know there's something that's coming out that's of interest, keep an eye on those 3 places, and then it's just a case of keep checking in your tenants to see if it's available. You should have test users. You can toggle if you've got early access to features in your tenant generally, and keep checking. Do you have any helpful hints there?
Yeah, so also the other place to look at is user voice. See where Microsoft are keeping people up abreast with what's happening with a particular feature you've asked for. So it'll tell you whether it's in progress, or if they've shelved it, or if they're looking to develop that any further, or if it's in thought and how they're thinking about pushing that content. And the other thing to point out as well is around, particularly on the Teams client piece, is around the cadence at different OSs. So you may have a different cadence to Android than you do iOS. And what you often see, particularly around those two pieces, they'll leapfrog each other, where they'll adapt features to iOS, and then you see Android catch up and then leapfrog it for feature parity. So they're continuously kind of evolving one device, and then they're bringing the other one up to it and evolving it beyond that. So it's quite neat. But as far as keeping up the development piece, absolutely user voice, tech communities, Microsoft Teams community, and then obviously whatever is evolving out from the Microsoft Teams Twitter feed as well.
Yeah, one thing to add to that is what we generally advise when I'm working with customers is not to do this in a random way, because it doesn't seem very professional that my job now is keeping up with what's on Twitter, reading Microsoft blogs and trying to understand what's coming where, looking in forums where Microsoft are going to be posting on user voice, we might be developing this feature soon. So part of that often is developing a target operating model, and that might be people that are responsible for understanding what's coming to the service. And that might be a service owner who's responsible for understanding the technical aspects that are coming along, and perhaps the product owner who might be responsible for working out what that means for new services and how they're going to be adopted in the business. And where I work, we even have someone whose job is a full-time job just monitoring the Microsoft roadmap. And because it's not one roadmap for you, in that roadmap, you've got the roadmap from Microsoft, but you've also got your own message center within your tenant. There's going to be changes that are coming to your tenant that will affect you, and the point that they arrive and you need to consider what actions you need to take will be different for me or Ben at the places we work. So that rollout, when they say we're rolling out this feature between January and June this year, then you need to keep abreast of what's happening in that message center to understand when it's coming to you and what changes you need to be able to take on board and make.
So does anyone remember looking at the published roadmap Microsoft had when Teams first released? But bearing in mind this was late 2016 when Teams sort of first came out in preview, and then it was through 2017, 2018 that Microsoft really started ramping up. They produced a bunch of PDF slides, effectively, that talked about what was available at the time of launch, what was coming in Q1 2018. Messaging didn't really change much. But the idea with this roadmap is Microsoft was being fairly open about what sort of stuff they were trying to put in the product. That was because there was messaging going around that Teams was the big new thing. It was going to replace Skype for Business at some point in the future, and that at some point in the future is still TBD. There is still a version of Skype on-prem if you want to use it. They will start fading out new tenants from getting Skype Online, but it's still there if you want to have it. So this roadmap back in the early days was kind of showing, that Microsoft was serious about this stuff and that they were going to start pushing these things in fairly rapidly. So like on the meetings roadmap, Q4 2017, audio conferencing in 90 countries. Stuff like Lobby being added in, being able to share an application into a meeting. These are all things that were bread and butter Skype for Business at the time that Teams wasn't able to do at release. Stuff over here, things like being able to pull PowerPoint in, being able to interop with VTC type solutions. I guess the point of what I'm trying to show here is that, if you know where Teams is at today, it's come an awful long way, particularly on the calling side. Like when it was launched, all of this stuff to do with calling was not available. So even things like being able to do call forwarding or transfer a call or do dialing via extension. Stuff like location-based routing. None of that stuff was available. And again, part of what we'll talk about on the telephony stuff is how some of these things work and some of what they can do. The point in kind of showing that was just really to give you an idea that, if you looked at Teams back when it first came out, it's come on a very, very long way from where it started, and that pace is really, really just accelerating. How many of you did Skype for Business voice deployments back in the day? So one of the things that I, as a Skype for Business consultant, used to have a problem with is I would go in, or Link, I'd talk to an organization, and they would say, I don't want to deploy Link, I'm quite happy with my PBX, because my PBX does XYZ feature, and I like that. And that's fine. And part of my job was like, well, fine, but why do you do that with your phone system? Why do you on a Tuesday press 1 to dial the mail room and then it has to redirect to somewhere else? Why is that a thing that your business does? And then we would work out an equivalent of how to do that in Link or Skype for Business. And it was really interesting to me in my organization that when Teams came along, people were like, well, I hate Teams, I don't like it because it doesn't do what Skype for Business did. And it was exactly that same mindset of just because it didn't do the one thing that I wanted, then I wasn't interested in it. However, you need to do that same thing of, well, what is the actual core item that I'm trying to achieve? What is it I'm actually trying to do? And look at it from a feature point of view of what are the pros and what are the cons. And Teams in particular, we find organizations will have tried it, they'll have found something that they perceive as a blocker, and then they'll sit and they'll wait for that feature to come out. But I guess kind of what I'm shooting for is blockers are not necessarily blockers, or they're certainly not going to be blockers for long. It's if you have a particular thing that you need Teams to do and it doesn't do it at the moment, that doesn't mean you can't deploy it to other parts of your organization. There might be other elements or other departments or other pieces that can take Teams, and by waiting until everything is ready, it's never going to be ready because it's always going to be changing or shifting or doing something different. So it's kind of looking at putting stuff in a balance. So the idea of there's one thing that it can't do, but it can do seamless mobile join. It can do plugin-less meetings via the web for guests, so they don't have to install a client. Jason talking about the mobile client. If I'm in a Teams meeting now, if I open the Teams client from my mobile phone, it says, oh, hey, you're in a meeting. Do you want to use this as a buddy device? So I can click on that, and I've now got a roving camera to go and show someone around the warehouse on the meeting that I'm in. That's stuff that Skype for Business was never able to do, and it's stuff that an organization never really thought that they needed to do. So just because you've got one thing or two things or three things that it can't do, I should urge you to do that evaluation of, well, maybe there's more on the positive than there is on the negative. And if you're stopped waiting for something to come out, you're going to blink and you're going to miss it and it's going to have been out and you've missed out on 6 months of actually having this deployed, getting your users used to it, getting them used to how it works, how it operates, etc. So Jason, I think, was going to talk a little bit about into the futures. So no pressure, but you've got half an hour to fill, Jason.
Yeah, I saw that. Thanks, guys. Right. So with how we've discussed things already and kind of seeing where we've come from in the past and where we've come from LCS all the way back through and where we're going to it now and how things have progressed with the product set and everything else, kind of the world itself is changing, not just the product, but how people work, if that makes sense. We're no longer just toting around. Almost everybody in front of us now has a laptop in front of them. A lot of you will have a tablet as well, a mobile phone. We'll be connected up to Azure AD. We'll be connected up to Office 365. These things will be managed through Microsoft 365. How we pull these all together will be multiple devices instead of using a single device. We'll be accessing things through the content we have. So we may have a OneDrive of our own. We may be using Dropbox. We may be using Box for our data storage. But in reality, we also have our business applications we use every single day. In addition to that, just take a look at Teams where we have our apps. Not all the applications within the store that we have there are dedicated for business applications. We can pull different things in, different ways we work, different things we use together to make that single, concise way, that one screen, that one desk, with that one way of we work as a business together. But we integrate our own lives and our own consumer products into these things. Likewise, we have how we manage these things. How is this software, different infrastructure ability that we have within this. So we're bringing our own things together. We're utilizing the cloud technology that we have together as this. In addition to this, we automate, we orchestrate, we pull all these things together. We utilize the Power Apps that we have. We bring things where we used to have standard rigid ways of doing things. We now can use Flow to pull these things together. Really, really be clever about how we're pulling all this content, have the right things. And likewise, we're being proactive with information. And one of the things we'll talk about tomorrow is the call quality dashboard. So I appreciate that's just a really small aspect of all of Office 365. But as far as how we can automate those things, how we can be proactive with the responses to these things, and then pull those things together. And likewise, the world's moving to more of a self-service way of doing things. So me as a consumer, I expect to be able to go into a portal and do my own work. I expect to be able to pull what I need out of on my machine. I expect to be able to provision my own teams. I expect to be able to create the channels I need to be able to do these things. I need to be active. I need to be proactive within that as well. So within this, how do we start looking at how we actually do this? And we take a look at some of the things that we'll touch on later as well, Brian will touch on, and Steve's touched on already, is how do we utilize all of Microsoft 365? How do we take what our ideas that we have and how do we share them? How do we take Yammer aspects and pull it in? How do we take Kazala things, and how do we take things and move them all into teams so that way we can work collaboratively together? And it allows us to pull all those different aspects into things and have it in a single location. Likewise, Microsoft 365 is built for teamwork. All the things that we utilize within it. I can drop things in OneDrive. This morning, we were working on slides this morning, and Steve was on the train. I was on the train, and Ben was already here. He was obviously very ambitious this morning.
Well, even that, that user voice bullet that you mentioned on my slide, I added that while Steve was presenting. So even though he's got that PowerPoint, that was in the middle of presenting, my updates were coming through on his slide. So Jason's in for a treat when he gets a bit further through his day.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it, is because I spoke about it and then I saw it on there and I thought to myself, I didn't remember seeing that on the slide earlier today. And it's obviously being able to build these things together and the ability to have 25, 30 people working on the same document, and these large organizations pulling things together, being able to pull everything within OneDrive, being able to work straight off of a single calendar, being able to pull all these different aspects together to work together. Obviously with that, things need to be simple. The user, our end users, are our lowest common denominator, right? They're always going to be the hardest point of any sort of ability to drive adoption, to drive the understanding, to drive the product, to drive all that aspects of everything that we do. Adoption is going to be key. And to do that, we need things to be super simple, super easy, and be able to do that. So a good example of that is now when you're triaging things through within Teams, and you load up another application, you now have search. Search will then propagate content through Teams. So I can be inside my Teams document, type in an aspect of so if I know that I've got a third party working on it named Acme, and I want to type in Acme to search within that, it doesn't just search within that document, it pulls up other documents within Teams. I can pull all that together. I'm integrating in what other people are doing back into the same application and be able to triage the content myself. I'm keeping things integrated. I'm keeping it super simple. And likewise, that intelligence security. I need it to be smart. I don't want my end users to be reliant on giving us the right security answer. I expect that to be done by the applications itself. So how do we apply the right digital rights management? How do we use Azure Active Information Protection? How do we pull all that together to be able to provide that for our end users? And it's likewise one of the things that was showcased earlier. What if I'm putting content that shouldn't be out there? So what if I'm putting my national insurance number or my social security number or credit card numbers within the document and sharing that out to an external party? That's obviously coming back to us as the information owner. So we have to be obviously compliant to our local legislation. And so one of the things we'll kind of touch on now is what the future state is for devices and some of the things that are really, really cool are coming up. So we've seen that Microsoft have opened up the ability to any native Teams device, and we've got Polly in the background, so we'll have to be relatively honest and agnostic. We've got anything that natives register to it natively, like telephones, handsets, star phones. What we're going to start seeing in the future is the ability to start having these things propagate into Microsoft Teams, and they're going to be managed by Intune. And with Intune, we'll start being able to apply policies and these type of things. So it's really, really clever, the things that Microsoft are pushing forward, particularly around the star phones, the large screen, the Teams room systems now, and large screen collaboration devices. Being able to do these things. Likewise, we want to be able to manage all this content and bring it back down. I want to be able to log onto a device and be able to have that right policies attributed to it, whether it's a Surface, whether it's a HP laptop that's running Teams. I want to be able to manage the policies that are on that within the actual client itself. So it's huge. But you got to remember that Microsoft have a open interoperability program. Likewise, again, they have a store in the US. You can go to the store, see what they've approved, what's been adopted, what's been accepted, what's been treated as acceptable, and then when you call Microsoft or you call your partner, or you call whoever your managed service partner is, you say, I've got an issue, then you can start triaging this. And some of the things I'll do tomorrow with this as well is when we look at the call quality dashboard, or if we start triaging some of the things that we're doing around voice and collaboration, we can see what the endpoints are. So we can see within that who has what problems. We can see which devices are creating us problems. We can find out whether or not machines that are running an HP desktop with a Jabra 710 is giving us grief. And we can start triaging why. Did they have the wrong drivers? Did they have the wrong content? What is wrong with that? Did we supply that only to one region? And then we can start triaging that backwards to find out how we give the end user the best experience. With this as well, we have some of the really, really new cool Teams devices. So Crestron, Yealink, HP, and Logitech are the big newcomers within the space now. All these are quite different from what the original approach was. If we take it back to the days of what used to be called Project Rigel, it was a Surface Pro 4 that was basically bolted into a docking station, a Microsoft-approved docking station, and within this, they had the ability to join and unjoin meetings, single button connect, and these devices have absolutely come on leaps and bounds. And again, these are all Microsoft Teams devices now, so when we register them, in the very near future, we'll be able to see them within our devices section within our Microsoft Teams piece. And with this as well, we'll be able to do, they all work very, very similarly, but they have different use cases. So one of them that's not here is a Lenovo device, and the HP device have inbuilt audio inside them. So you don't have to have a third-party audio device connect up to it. If it's small room, you can go and do this. Likewise, they all have different sizes. So depending on what your requirements are for the size of the room, you can then apply the right size devices for that. Again, they all work very, very similarly. They're all Windows 10 IoT devices, which are managed through Intune.
If I've got devices I was using before, Jason, can I bring them with me?
It depends if they're Microsoft's, if they're on the certified list. So if they were certified on Skype, the answer is yes, they should be certified on Teams. However, if we go to that website, that right there, the office.com Teams devices website, and we look that up, we can find out they are. So some are not, is the short and sweet. For personal devices, the answer is yes. For personal devices, if I have a headset that was certified on Skype, it'll be certified in Teams. What you'll often see now is if you plug in a device, some features of these devices are still being worked on. So if I want to be able to use the hang up, pick up, volume, those adjustment features are being worked on with Microsoft and the suppliers of the third parties, the vendors, to be able to get those features in. But they're obviously working on it going forward. So some of the things that are really cool that are coming up that we're going to see in the near future. So I don't have timelines on exactly when we're going to see all these things. So one of the big ones, the most popular ones that we've brought right now is support for private channels. So I have the ability to create a channel, lock that down. So regardless of what team it's in, I can have something private within that. So that, for me, is huge. So we're now starting to see things where we have ethnical walling and Chinese walls with the content. Now we're going to be able to start locking that down even further. So with the ability to privatize the channel itself, so I can invite everybody in this classroom into the meeting space, into the team itself, create a channel, lock that down to just 2 tables, so that way we can work on it. So we can start segregating that content through, and for us, that's huge.
I was going to say, for us, we, trying to figure out how we use Teams with our customers, we generally end up having to have 2 different teams, one that is external and shared with the client, and one that is internal for our, behind-the-scenes chat and are we on target, etc. Things like private channels will mean that we can now just have the single team and be a little bit more aware about who's coming in, who can see what and who can't. And it's these sort of things that just start chipping away at those ease of use and management things.
And probably to add to that, when I'm talking about clients that are looking to make the move from tools like Slack, then that's where private channels come in, where they've had open workspaces which are, from their perspective, equivalent to Teams, and they've wanted to be able to have this open so everybody can see all the public channels within it, but then request to join individual channels. If they want to work in that sort of more open way with Microsoft Teams, then this really helps that happen. But there are limitations for things like private channels, where it's not like the rest of the suite. So it is a lockdown private channel, and it's got tools like access to SharePoint files, but not necessarily all of those other Office 365 group connected services like Planner and so on. So as we understand it, the version that they've demoed that'll be version 1 of private channels will give you that separate SharePoint site that will have the lockdown channel, the lockdown conversations for a subset of that communication. So the model should probably be use public channels, well, use normal channels within the team for everything you can, and then private channels for that real lockdown chat and files.
Yep. We'll also start seeing where the group calendars will start coming through. So for right now, we can start pulling our Office 365 groups and the calendars within that, and those will start becoming the teams. A big one for anybody that works within a consultancy practice, the ability to have multiple team accounts within the same team. So if I have within the same team's client, so if I want to be able to access something, and we can start pulling these things and start becoming quite more seamless in how we start integrating these things through. So obviously right now I can log on to a Teams tenant, but I could also log on to the Teams tenant with the same time, so I could be logged into 2 tenants at the same time, or multiple tenants at the same time.
And that can be quite a problem at the moment, because if you're using Teams for telephony and you swap to another tenant, suddenly my phone's, unless I'm signed in on my desk, unless I'm signed in on mobile, which, hey, you should be because it's Teams, it goes everywhere, but you're not in on your primary client anymore. So one of the things that's going to go hand in hand with that is this idea of breakthrough. So even if you're signed in on another tenant in your Teams client, it knows where your home was, and stuff can still punch through and find you. So still get notifications and still take a call.
Yeah, like that. Bottom one we've got where we allow different notification options for the teams and channels as well. So within that, if I want, I can start choosing what notifications we want available. So if I want if somebody posts something within a particular channel or a particular team, I can say I want a different notification. Likewise, if I want to receive a telephone call, I can make sure that breaks through. Likewise, we're going to start seeing multi-window chats. So we can start, Microsoft are looking into it right now. So can I have, I think it's going to be still held within the panes. I don't think they're going to break out from that, but I think we're going to have the ability to have multiple chats on the go within the same view, if that makes sense.
Little Bird says it might be into a separate window.
Oh, wow. We'll see.
Jason, you've got it now. You should.
I know.
You obviously haven't looked at it.
Ability to see who's in the channel. So we can do this now to an extent, but I think they're going to make this even easier. So if you're not an admin, you can start having visibility who's within these things. The big one for me is this memory consumption piece. I'm not sure how many of you load up Task Manager and see how hungry Teams is, but Microsoft are working diligently to start cracking on this and breaking down, so that way we're going to see a lot less of the consumption that we're seeing. And I know that they're rejigging a lot of the actual infrastructure in which the actual OS within how Microsoft Teams is going to work. And I've seen the future, and it actually looks really, really good. So some of the things they're going to be working with the client itself, preemptive spinning up applications, getting things to work the way, so that way when you go into Teams, it's already ready to go. Channels will be already set up and going. And on top of that, they're going to work on how we break down the actual consumption within the Teams client itself, so that way we're not utilizing 100% processor and using 300 meg worth of memory whilst we're using it. And like we said, we also have the ability to edit and change the notifications.
The notifications thing, that's hopefully moving into the action center. So at the moment, Teams notifications are the app building, giving you the notifications. You've got this nice framework in Windows 10 where you have the action center, notifications go down the right-hand side. You can do things like put yourself in focus mode so you don't get chat messages coming through, which, in Teams, great. You in a meeting, you do a presentation, it puts Windows into DND, but Teams notifications can still pop up. When they move into the action center, they'll obey that, you won't see them, etc. So it's neat little tweaks.
And that's one of the biggest things I've heard back from users, is when they're doing a presentation, they're still getting Teams chat notifications popping up over the window like this, which is quite annoying when they didn't have that experience when they were using Skype for Business. Mm-hmm. But on the memory consumption side, if you've been using Skype for Business today on premises and you're using tools like using VDI, then you'll probably be used to about 70 to 80 meg consumption on the Skype for Business client. And then when you move across to VDI, and it is 400, 450 megabytes of RAM, then it makes a big difference. Yeah. So bringing that memory down, as Jason says, the way that the client will progressively loading in all of the different components to reduce the memory footprint is going to be quite good.
A couple of big ones recently around call queues and auto attendance. So Skype Prem used to have response groups. They mapped into call queues and auto attendance online. And there was a V2 release of them recently that added a bunch of new stuff, including it changed the model, so you had to have a service account that you assign against a call queue or an auto attendant. Just recently, they figured out how to mean that didn't have to be a licensed account if you're not doing any call forwarding with it. But part of the reason they changed it to be a service account is with a thing called direct routing. You can assign your users in the cloud with a phone number that's coming from gateways back in your office. If you have a service account running the auto attendant, you can give that a direct routing number, and now you can pass that number through from whoever your telephony provider on-prem is and pump that through into Office 365. So it was one of those things that it was great, people were wanting to do it, but it had this wrinkle for about a couple of months where there was this licensing issue where the Teams development team had got in front of the Microsoft licensing group coming out with this new licensing SKU. And an evolution of that is going to be, again, hopefully, at the moment, if you want to do a call forward out of a call queue, you have to have an account that you license, you log in as that user, you put a call forward on it. Yeah. With this notion of having resource accounts in there, hopefully you'll be able to assign your resource account and say, I want that to forward out to another number. And as soon as that goes in there, if the relevant APIs come out through Graph, you could start building some nice scenarios for, you've got an out of hours, people in your business used to log into a web page, they changed the phone number and that was how the divert worked. There's no equivalent for that in Teams, but you can see where they would be going with that, that if you've got Flow, you've got the Graph APIs, you've got a resource account and you've got a redirect, you can now suddenly build a neat little workflow of email this particular mailbox with this particular phone number and it will change the phone number that you're doing a divert. So that's a little bit, that's me hoping that's how that's going to work. But you can see these components sort of building together.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of evolution. I mean, I've only taken a snippet of what some of the most impactful that I thought they were going to be towards me. But obviously, the rate in which Teams is evolving from its conception to where we are now is alarming in a good way, in that sense that we're seeing the product being updated so drastically with everything, all the components in which it resides in, whether it's Exchange or OneDrive or SharePoint, and all the different aspects that we have within it, which we'll touch on later on. It's really impressive to see how fast that product's coming.
The thing I find weird is there's such little fanfare with stuff. It's, one day you can't do anything, and the next day there's no big announcement, no big CU, just boom, your client updates and you can do something.
Yeah, so the plan for today is to try and make sure that if you've taken 2 days out of your day job, that we're not trying to fill that with just talking at you all day long. So we've intentionally spaced out a lot of these sessions, so there's always going to be a bit of a break. We've set the room out in a classroom format as well, so that you've got the opportunity to get on with, keep up to date on what's happening with work if you need to, and have a chat. As we look around the room here, we know that I can see a few faces that have spoken at our user groups before. So you've got some experts in the room. One person was even in the Microsoft Teams launch video. I'm not going to embarrass them by looking at them. So there's and there are people here who. Same person, following his blogs to learn about all the different meeting room systems that he's trying, and someone, and they won't know who they are because there's a few people that the company I work for are working with. Our consultant said, these are some of the smartest people we've ever worked with. So the person you're sitting next to might be a real expert in Office 365, so feel free to reach out and have a chat to some of them as well while we're in the breaks. Because when we say that we're planning on doing a Q&A at the end, this isn't ask us questions. You might want to actually answer some of the questions yourself. So what we usually do at the user groups is it is meant to be more interactive. So you're not just asking the people who've come along to present. We know that you're doing this on a day-to-day basis, and everybody's got their own perspective of where they are, what the challenges they're seeing at their business is, and how they've overcome them. So we learn often as much as you do from talking to other people when we're at these events. So we're going to have a short break now, chance to get a bit of a coffee. We'll also try and make sure that we've got seats for the late arrivals at the back. Yeah. Rejig the room slightly to make sure everyone can sit down.
In terms of drinks and stuff from a housekeeping point of view, we should have said at the beginning, there weren't any planned fire alarms today, so if there are, you just go straight out onto the street and turn right. And the back corner is where there's tea, coffee, and even the stuff in the fridges down the right-hand side. You can help yourselves too, courtesy of Microsoft.
Yes, and we'll even have lunch for you. You don't have to go off and buy your own.
So before we break out, were there any questions or anything to get us started, or anything we can have a think around for answering later on? Go on. Got to be a nasty question in there somewhere.
When's the next Evolve conference, Ben?
October the 21st, Steve.
So it's not, for some reason I thought it was the 7th of October until I saw this line.
Oh my God, Stephen.
Did Microsoft reorganise their conference around
this? Yes. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, we had Microsoft change their conference so we can keep ours, yeah.
That's
And school
absolutely true.
holidays and everything, so it was
Yeah.
a bit of a nightmare arriving at that date.
Yes, so we'll be up in Birmingham on the 21st of October. And if you've never been to Evolve before, when we started it a few years ago, we started it in a garden centre. We didn't run it from there, but we sat in a garden centre, me, Jason, and a chap who's not involved anymore. And we had this idea that at the moment there wasn't these conferences. They just stopped doing Tech Ed Europe, so there wasn't like a Barcelona to go and learn about tech for a week. And my whole history in IT, working in an IT department, has been that I was never able to go to these overseas conferences. No one would pay £2,000 for me to go and see this stuff. So we wanted to try and bring some of those sessions from Tech Ed at the time, What's Ignite now, and try and bring those locally to somewhere in the middle of the country where most people can get to.
I was about to say, I know what I'll do. I'll create a conference in Birmingham.
And also local to where we live as well, because yeah, a lot of stuff is London centric, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's people who live all over the country, so we decided we'd do that at the same place where some of the VMware user groups are also running their yearly conference as well, where it's easy to get to. There's flights in from all over Europe. Trains all seem to arrive there, a bit like London really, but not. And it's worked well. And over that time, there's lots of other conferences that are around as well. So Ignite the Tour come every year. They started off for the first few years also in Birmingham as well. They couldn't book the date this year. So they were in London, and they're next February next year. We've also got other conferences popping up. So if you're based in Scotland, you've got the Scottish Summit coming up. I think in February as well. And just on the outskirts of London, a new conference that's just been started today. What's it, UC?
I'm trying to think where Comms Summit?
Commsverse.
Commsverse, yes.
That a former MVP, Mark Vale, has just started up. So if you want to learn about this stuff, then there's lots of opportunities to do it. We like to think that we were one of the first to try and bring an Ignite-style conference to the Midlands. Because no one else wanted to. But there's lots more conferences like that. But save the date. What we've tried to do, as we said at the beginning, is make it free. We don't want people to be charged to come to a community conference. And what we're really lucky to have is sponsors. I think, did someone say Polycom are in the room, or Poly are in the room? They're usually one of our sponsors. A lot of those vendors, not Microsoft partners if you work for one, no one that's looking to take your business away, but the partners that provide, or the vendors that provide those tools that you need on migrations to enable your voice systems, for Teams. All of those people help us put on the conference, and they help sponsor that, and in return we're able to give you a totally free conference to attend, and also help us bring in people from all over the world who are the experts on the topic that they talk about to talk to you and share their knowledge. Save the date. Registration will be open probably in a couple of weeks' time.
The good news as well, it's not team-centric. It's all of Azure, all of Microsoft 365, so it's all in. So it's not just going to one piece, one component. It's the whole gambit. So anything to do with Azure and Microsoft 365, you can grab as much content as you want on that.
We bucked the trend with a Prem server track last year as well.
We did, yeah.
But we still had one, didn't we?
Yeah. Cheers, everybody.
Well,
Thank you.
Prem server.
Thanks.
We got Brian at around 11 o'clock. So,
We can do if you want, or
yeah. So do you want to have what?
Does that impact lunch, or like give me 15 minutes more?
Do you want more time?
I can fill the whole day.
go for it.
Go on,
Yeah.
Brian.
Okay. Okay. So, shall we?
40?
Yeah. Let's start at 2:45.
Cool. I didn't throw the mic at you.
maybe wave to me or you, but Chantal, the black lady that's in reception, will wave to you when lunch is ready.
If you want to grab your seats back, we'll make a start. Okay, so we're ready for session number 2. That's better. This apparently is a microphone, okay? And so in theory, if I ask questions, I can throw the microphone at you, but I'll probably hit that and then take out the people on the front row. So maybe I won't use that as a microphone. I'm like, okay, all right. So my name's Brian. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master in Exchange Server. Used to teach the Certified Master program over in Redmond when Microsoft ran it a number of years ago. I'm an Office 365 MVP, and I'm director of a gold partner that I run here in the UK. We have offices in Cape Town and Hong Kong as well, called MB Consult. I'm here today to do 2 sessions with you. Later this afternoon, we're going to look at compliance and data security, if you want. This morning's session, we're going to look at user security or identity. Okay? The aim of our 2 days is to look at Teams and everything around it. A number of years ago, I used to teach a program for Microsoft called Exchange Environmental Dependencies. And Exchange Environmental Dependencies, I can't remember the acronym. Anyway, lost that. The idea of Exchange Environmental Dependencies was a 5-day in-depth course that we ran at Microsoft, and it was everything about Exchange, but not Exchange. We did a day on DNS, for example. We did a day on IP routing, okay? Some of the interesting stuff that we used to do. We did a day on MIIS, or what it was called back then, and a whole bunch of that are still valid today, but I haven't got you for 5 days, and I haven't got you for Teams environmental dependencies. But that's some of the idea of what we're going to cover in this session. Okay? We're going to look at what is not Teams, but what I need to get right to make Teams work. Okay? And we're going to start with an identity piece. So we're going to be looking at things like security, how I log on, how I secure my logon sessions, how I can access and restrict access to Teams. Now, actually, I could do that for Exchange Online, SharePoint, Skype, etc. It doesn't really matter. Teams is just an application as far as this piece is concerned. But what we roll out here, what we look at here, we can do for Teams just like we could do for anything else. Okay? We're going to have a look at, and we're going to do a lot of whiteboarding, is the idea of this one, rather than slides. And we're going to take your suggestions, your feedback, say, well, we do it this way, or we're interested in that. How would that work here? And so that's part of the plan of the way we'll look at it. Okay. I've got myself an order. Where's it gone? There we go. And so my general idea is to have a look at users, licenses, how we do some admin. Don't worry about the small print, that's in my notes. How we log on, so authentication. Some of the security options that are available to us and how they work. MFA will always come up because that's very important. Okay? And we'll finish off with some options on passwords, or at least the getting rid of passwords, so passwordless sign-in. Okay? And then all that will tie back to how we can fit that into Teams. Okay. If you want to contact me, that's my details. I'll leave them on the screen for a little bit longer, and then I'll remove them as I do some more whiteboarding. First thing up we're going to talk about is users. Okay. So one thing that I find very common, I go and speak to a customer, and they've got Office 365, and I'll talk about Azure Active Directory. And they're like, no, we don't have that. Okay? And there's a great disconnect between understanding what you've actually got in the cloud. I've got this. Well, actually, that means you've got this, and this. Okay? And so Azure Active Directory is my directory in the cloud. Okay? Just like AD, Active Directory, is my directory on-premise. Okay? And we can do LDAP directories and other directories as well and make all that work. But for the majority, the very large majority of people, it'll be AD on-premises. It'll be Azure AD in the cloud. There are companies that are cloud only. NB Consult is cloud only. We don't have an AD on-premises. The company only existed 6 or 7 years ago. We decided to be a cloud company, okay, and run everything off the cloud. But the majority of my customers, they've got some legacy. It's great calling AD legacy, isn't it? They've got an AD environment. I've got customers with 15 AD environments, all separate. You know, how do we make that work? Okay? And so there's some of the things we're going to mention. Okay? So, as a sort of show of hands, how many people, that was probably mentioned earlier, but actually I wasn't looking at that point, but how many people have not yet started a cloud migration? So they really don't have Office 365 and Azure AD. Nobody. Everybody's got something. Okay. How many of you have chosen to, oh, actually, there's a question. How many of you don't have AD? Right, everyone's got AD, fine. Okay, so a couple of things about AD that's worth setting as a baseline. You probably well know this, but if I have Active Directory and I have my cloud tenancy, Azure Active Directory, okay, from a licensing perspective, especially if you're enterprise licensing, Microsoft Enterprise licensing, okay, you can have one Azure Active Directory tenant. All your licenses go into that one tenant. Okay. You're not supposed to, you get special dispensation to have multiple tenants. But you should avoid multiple tenants because the collaboration stuff isn't great. Okay? There's a whole bunch of merger and acquisition scenarios that are then problematic because you have two tenants. You've got your tenant and the company that has acquired you or the company you're acquiring and their tenant. And how do you make all that work? But the general aim, the general idea would be single tenant, okay, in the cloud, single Azure Active Directory tenant. On-premise, that could be one or many separate Active Directory forests. Okay? So how many people have more than one Active Directory forest in their organization? 10 or 15%, 20% maybe. Okay. That works. We can do that. Okay? That's not a problem with regards to what we're looking at. But what we have available to us is the ability within Active Directory, let's take that one out and do some drawings, is we can create, and let's do a cloud. Okay, so there's my cloud, and there's my Azure Active Directory. Okay. Up in Azure Active Directory, I have my user. Okay. I've got my Active Directory, let's do blue. Active Directory is all triangles. Okay. I have my user in Azure Active Directory. Let's call my user Mary. Okay, so I've got a user called Mary. She's created Azure Active Directory. She's created Active Directory. Okay, and I've got my Azure Active Directory tenant. I spin up my Azure Active Directory tenant. That's my admin, let's say. I'm going to call it admin. It's the first user I create. I'm going to say on Microsoft. I can't spell. All right. I create my first user account. When I create my tenant, I choose my company name. They suggest a tenancy name for me. That's my name I give at tenantname.onmicrosoft.com. Okay? That's a cloud account. Okay? It exists only in the cloud. Okay? You will have one of those, okay? Because you get one when you first create your tenant. Okay? There's a very good use for those. Okay? There's a good use for limiting those as well. Okay? There are scenarios where maybe you'll do all of it as cloud accounts, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay? Once I've got that in place, though, I've got the ability to synchronize my Active Directory to my Azure Active Directory. Okay? DirSync, to give it an older term. Or Azure Active Directory Connect is the tool that we'd use nowadays to do that. There are third-party tools that do the same thing as well, but Azure Active Directory Connect is what we'll find, especially for consultants, will go out or we'll put into place for people. Okay? So Azure Active Directory Connect is a box that I run, a Windows service that I run somewhere, and Azure Active Directory Connect connects into my Active Directory, reads the data out of my Active Directory, so it needs an account that has read permissions, puts it into its own database. It's called the metaverse, and there's connector spaces and a whole bunch of terminology there that we might mention a bit. Okay. Connects to the cloud, so we tell it the tenancy details. So in this case, we'd tell it admin at on Microsoft, etc. Okay. And it reads data in from the cloud and puts all this into the Azure Active Directory Connect database. And it works out the relationships between cloud users and on-premise users, or objects in the cloud and objects on-premise. Okay. If this is a brand new, just started environment, okay, and I ran, let's say, express mode when I configured Azure Active Directory Connect, it will make for me the account that does all the reading, and it gives it sort of fairly global, fairly general write permissions as well. Okay. It will create for me a very limited account up in the cloud. So although I will type in the admin account when I set it up, it will create a limited account for me that I can't delete. And it will use that account to read and write in the cloud. Okay. So it's not running as global admin or anything like that, although I do need global admin to set it up. Okay. And then it will take the information that it receives, it finds in one, and if it's express mode, it's the whole of the directory. And it will write that information up to the cloud. So what we'd end up with in this scenario is we'd end up with Mary, let's assume M up there, we'd end up with a user object called Mary up in Azure Active Directory as well. As I make changes to Mary on-premise, so let's say we've given her a name, my mum, let's call her Mary Reed. Okay. So I change her display name on-premise. The connectors within Azure Active Directory Connect will see that and will write that change later. Okay? Who knows how often? Not 15? Not 3 hours? 30 minutes. Yeah, there you go. All right. Okay. You can change the schedule. You can stop the schedule. Okay? You can run it manually. So you can do it every 30 seconds. Microsoft might throttle your activity there if you do. But absolutely, is this working? Make a change, run it manually. Oh, yeah, it's working. Let's go back to the half an hour. Okay? Or I've just sacked, nobody here from Deutsche Bank? No, okay. I've just sacked 18,000 employees. Quick, run it now. Yeah, that sort of scenario. Okay, and anybody related to anybody is not meant to be a joke, of course. But as an example, okay, there are times when I might need to run it quicker than the half an hour schedule. So I make a change, half an hour's gone by, and so of course her display name is updated in the cloud. I'm just shortcutting it for simplicity. Okay. Try this. Let's go into the cloud and change her display name. Okay. So for a bit of colour. Let's say I want to change it to a maiden name, or whatever, T. And of course my mother's maiden name is one of my super secret pieces of information that I'm never going to tell you, because all my password resets are based off my mother's maiden name. If only they weren't. Okay. If I try and change a synced user attribute that comes from on-premise in the cloud, it won't let me. It's read-only. Okay. There's a single master, and with Azure Active Directory Connect in place, that master is Active Directory. If the attribute exists on-premise, then I can't change it in the cloud. That makes my admin interesting, and when we talk about licenses in a moment, we'll see why that can become very interesting. Okay. But while I've got a synced account, okay, I have to do my admin on-premise, which might not be a big issue. I've been doing my admin on-premise for however long. In comes the cloud, and I don't really have to change a lot of the user provisioning and deletion. A new hire, I could just create them in AD like I created them before. There's a few more things to consider, but it's not a massively different scenario. And this is what most medium and larger companies will be doing. In the smaller business space, okay, or in the environment where there's no Active Directory on-premise, okay, then we'll create the users straight away in the cloud. Okay. So if I create a cloud user, okay, so like my admin on Microsoft user account, okay, I can create other accounts up in the cloud. Okay. Now, before I do a lot of this, one of the first things I'll probably do is register my domain up there. Okay, and my demos are Contoso. So, for example, I could add contoso.com into my tenant, and then I could create a user account. Let's have a user here, call them Bill at contoso.com. Okay. I could create that user account directly up there. Okay? There's no bill in AD. Okay? That user is fully read-write in the cloud. Okay? Now, if I start mixing my identities like this, that's where my admin becomes difficult. It's like, I need to change Mary's details. I have to do that on premise. I need to change Bill's details. Oh, he's a cloud person. I've got to change him in the cloud. Okay? So there's a tendency that you'll go for one or the other. Okay? Small businesses tend to go for cloud. Larger businesses, because they've got AD and they've got management and that's what they're used to, tend to put the sync in place. And of course, sync needs a server and other things like that as well. So there tends to be a cost of implementation. It's free software, but there tends to be a cost of implementation to consider as well. Where this, as I say, becomes interesting, though, is let's say I have a bill down here as well. And if I have a bill down here, and I go and manually create a bill up in the cloud, well, who am I logging in as? I log into Windows, I'll probably log in with Bill on-premise. But I open up Exchange Online, I'm logging in with Bill in the cloud. Okay? I try and sync Bill, and it fails, because there's already an object up there that matches. Okay? There is a bit of tech running called hard and soft match, which allows it to try and, well, that bill equals that bill, therefore they must be the same. I'll overwrite and try and merge some of the settings. Okay? But it can be problematic if you have multiple, let's say, user types. So on-prem synced or cloud only. Okay? And for my last one, it's not really relevant for Teams. Okay? Of course, I could create users in AD and not sync them. I could have objects, user accounts, groups, and so on, that don't appear in the cloud. Okay? But if they don't appear in the cloud, I can't give resources to them. So for example, if I have a security group on-prem, and I choose not to sync the security group OU, well then I can't permission stuff in the cloud to members of that security group. Okay? If I have a user on-prem and I put them in an OU, and I choose not to sync that OU, that user doesn't exist in the cloud. Indeed, if I took the OU that Mary was in and decided not to sync that OU, Mary disappears from the cloud. Okay? If a user account is in scope for sync, and then later is in scope not to be synced, the account is deleted in the cloud. There's 30 days and I can get it back, but it's gone. There's no access, they can't log in, there's no data that they can get access to, and so on. Okay? And so you have things like leaver scenarios. What do I do when someone leaves the company? Do I put them into a leavers OU? Do I sync the leavers OU? Or what happens if I do that? What's the implications of that? And that matters for Teams as well. You know, where's all those one-to-one chats they've done gone? Where's the compliance? And we'll look at that later today, and how that matters. Okay. So from a user perspective, okay, we have to have the user in the cloud so they can log in. Therefore, we have to have them in the cloud so they can have Teams, etc. Okay. If they're on-prem and we sync them, they're read-only in the cloud for the majority of their attributes. They're certainly read-only in the cloud for everything that you can set on-premise. Okay. And if you have duplicates, watch out for clashes and so on. Okay. A little bit more technical that's going on with this. Let's do this in black. Okay. Something that's worth being aware of with regards to my identities is what's called immutable ID. How do I know, for example, Mary on-prem is Mary in the cloud? What happens if I change her name? Is she still Mary on-prem in the cloud? How does that work? You know, people can get married, people can get divorced, people can change their name. Well, if I change your display name, if I change your common name, that gets synced up to the cloud. It's going to keep working. And it's done with a concept called immutable ID. There's a value on my cloud user called the immutable ID. I'll just draw it a black line, and I'll call it X. Okay. There's a value on my object on-premise, and I'm also going to call it a black line and X, although just for argument's sake, that will do for now. Okay. And it's this value that ties the two users together. Okay. I don't change this value on-premise, and when I try and sync Mary up, it's like, well, I'm actually syncing X to X. Okay. If there is no X in the cloud, if there's no object, immutable ID of X, it will make an object for me. Okay. If the immutable ID X disappears on-premise, it will delete the matching object in the cloud for me. Okay. A number of years ago, immutable ID on premise, or the source object for immutable ID on premise, was the object GUID. The object GUID is an attribute that gets set on every user account that you create in AD. Okay? It's a base 64, it's a GUID, sorry, rather than base 64, it's a GUID value, and it's read-only. Okay? It gets created when the object is made, and I cannot change it. Okay? That's fine if you're a single forest environment. Actually, single domain environment, even multi-domain is problematic for this. Okay? I sync the user up, okay? And up in the cloud, there's an attribute in Azure Active Directory called immutable ID. Immutable ID is a string. Okay? It's base 64. But if you take the base 64 string and convert it to a GUID, you'll see that it matches. Okay? They look different, but they're actually the same value. Okay? So here, where I've called it X, well, just for confusing, it might be Y here, that's the GUID Y, but it becomes base 64X. It's actually the same value. So I'm just going to call it X for simplicity. Okay. There's a problem there, though. The problem is, if I have multiple forests or multiple domains on premise, and I use things like binary tree or quest, and I want to do user migrations. Okay. If I take Mary, let's say that's the merge and acquisition scenario, for example. That's the old forest. I've got reasons why I think the old forest is badly designed, badly implemented, has issues. I've seen all those as comments for a forest migration. Or it's a mergers and acquisition scenario, and we need to move them into a new forest. If I do that, the migration tools will copy all the attributes across, but they can't copy object GUID. Object GUID is read-only. Okay? So I use my migration tool, ADMT and upwards, there's a whole bunch of them, okay? And I create a user here called Mary, okay? But her object GUID now, let's say, is Y. Let's say I choose to sync this user account up to the cloud. We'll provision a second Mary. Okay. If I log in as this second Mary, all my teams are gone, my voice is not working, my mailbox is missing, everything doesn't work. Okay. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft changed the way Azure Active Directory Connect worked. And you can move to this model if your Azure Active Directory Connect is quite old. They have a thing called MSDS consistency GUID. It takes a lot longer to write than it does to say. Okay. It's an on-premise attribute. It's been around since about 2008, AD schema, I think. Okay. And there's nothing in it. It's empty. Okay. This is now able to be used by Azure Active Directory Connect as your source attribute for your anchor. Okay. So it's called your source anchor, in effect, on-premise. Okay. So rather than using object GUID, it can use MSDS consistency GUID. Okay. And what it'll do is it'll copy your object GUID value into your MSDS consistency GUID for you. Azure AD Connect will do that. Okay. So if I turn on this, let's call that MSDS. MSDS equals X. So where my object GUID was X, my MSDS consistency GUID is also X, or actually it's not a GUID, it's a string, so it looks different. It's actually the same value. If you did a conversion in PowerShell or something like that, you'd see it's the same value. Okay. So yeah, open up the AD tools and it looks different, but it's actually not. Okay. Now I come and do my quest, binary tree, etc., ADMT or whatever migration. Okay. I get a new object GUID of Y, but my MSDS value is X. I copy that across. So in my mergers and acquisition scenario, I copy across the attribute that ties me to the object in the cloud. Okay. I come back to my sync engine, and I update my sync engine to read and write from my new forest. I have to be careful not to read and write Mary at the same time that I'm reading and writing this one. I can only have the source user once. There's a few things, tweaks I can do to make it work more than once. But generally speaking, Mary exists here. She logs in over here. It gets to some weekend. It's our cutover weekend. We move Mary across. She comes in on the Monday, and now she logs in to the new environment. Okay. And in that weekend, and there are ways around this, but generally speaking, I will stop Mary syncing in the first forest. That means she will disappear in the cloud because I've removed her from the scope of sync on-premise. And then half an hour later, and this is where I might do it more frequently, but I do a sync. Half an hour later, I take Mary and I move her into an OU that is syncing in the new forest. But because she has an MSDS consistency GUID value that matches a deleted object in the cloud, it undeletes the object in the cloud, and then this Mary now equals that Mary. User comes in on Monday, nothing has changed because we've copied all the attributes. We've copied all the groups she belongs to, we've copied all the security, etc. Okay. So from a Teams perspective, I could do an AD migration over a weekend with no data impact to the user. Very achievable, okay, but takes some architecture and some knowledge on how it works. And so there's one thing we need to be aware of when we're looking at what we're doing on-premise. Be comfortable with the idea that AD is my master, source of authority. I write stuff in AD, it's read-only in the cloud, but it's not based on my username or my display name or anything like that. It's based on my object GUID. If you're a single domain in a single forest, that's fine. But if you're in a scenario where it's multi-domain, multi-forest, you should move to MSDS consistency GUID and then consider that when you're migrating your objects across. And so at the end of all this, be it, again, single domain, single forest, or multi-domain, many forests, many environments, okay, I'll have the user account once or a few times on-premise. It'll result in a single user up in the cloud. And then I can look at things like, how do I allow the user in the cloud to do what I want that user to do? Okay. That's usually licensing. Okay. It certainly starts with licensing. Okay. There's no concept in AD of licensing. There's no attribute in AD that says, here's the CAL that you have, if you remember your client access licenses and stuff like that, back in when everything was on-prem only. Okay. CALs were very much a trust. I've got 100 users, I buy 100 licenses. Okay. But I could have 200 users and have 100 licenses. There was very few things that were barriers to that idea. It was trust-based. In the cloud subscription model, if I have 100 users, I have 100 licenses. If I have 101 users, one user doesn't get a license, one user can't use the service. So I buy another license. Okay. But I don't go and buy 200 licenses unless I am made of money. Okay. So there's no concept of license on-premise. So there's an example of an attribute that exists in Azure AD that I might need to set, or I will need to set. Okay. And so from a licensing perspective, if I want to give a user the right to use Teams, I need to give them a Teams license. If I want to give the user the right to have an Exchange Online mailbox, I need to give them an Exchange Online license. If I need them to have OneDrive or SharePoint, I need to give them a SharePoint license. There isn't a separate OneDrive license. Okay. And I can buy individual licenses, or I can buy packages of licenses, the SKU. Okay. I've got a demo later, and the demo is based on the Microsoft 365 E5 license. Okay. Now, I could do a 2-hour session on licensing as well, but I'll bore you all. Okay. But when I do my demos, I tend to put them in the most license, just because it means I don't lose any features. But features are going to be important. We need to know what packages we need to buy to get the certain features that we're going to get. So as we talk through some of the stuff in this session, we'll mention the license that's important as well. Okay? But at the moment, none of this is license specific. I don't need a specific license to do any of this. Obviously, there was some on-prem tools for migrating that's out of scope for the conversation. I need to buy those. But for the cloud stuff, when I get a tenant, I get an Azure AD tenant, and I can do this. I can create these objects. There's no limitations on me. Somewhere in the 50,000 or more license objects I'm limited to, but generally speaking, there's no license limitation. But I take my user, and I can give them a license. I give them a license that provisions the service for them. So I give them a SharePoint license. It goes and creates their OneDrive location. I give them a Teams license. It lets them log into Teams. I give them an Exchange Online license, and everything goes wobbly because it's really strange with Exchange. Okay. Those other two licenses, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, although there's a SharePoint on-prem, we can ignore that. Okay. There isn't a Teams on-prem. there's no attributes in AD that Teams makes use of. Teams is cloud only, and you'll be well aware of that. So if I come and want to do any Teams-specific admin, okay, it's all read-write in the cloud, because all those attributes that Teams makes use of, okay, they're all not read-only. They're not restricted because they don't exist on-prem. Okay, unless they're general AD attributes. So I want to have your, here's a good example. Teams shows me as BR, Brian Reed. Okay? But if my on-prem AD says read B as my display name, who's got back-to-front display names in AD? About 10, 15% of you, yeah, okay. The cloud will take the first letter of the first word in your display name and the first letter of the second word, or maybe sometimes the last word, it's not consistent, in your display name to make your initials. Okay? So I've got customers, they're in the sort of the read Brian type scenario, and so the icon is RB, but not BR. Okay? So I think, okay, well, I need to change that. That doesn't look right. I can't change your display name in the cloud because your display name is an AD attribute, therefore it's read-only in the cloud. So although you might see this surfaced in Teams, you need to be aware that the attribute is read-only in the cloud because it's a core AD attribute. But other things that to do with Teams, so for example, we turn on audio conferencing or stuff like that. What telephone number are we going to give you for audio conferencing? That's a cloud setting. That belongs in the cloud. We don't have an AD equivalent, and therefore it's not read-only in AD. So I give my user the license, and then I can do these things for the user. I can give a user individual licenses, or I can give them a package of licenses as a SKU. So for example, I could have an Office 365 E3 license, probably the most common one. Okay? Or I could have a Microsoft 365 E3 license, which is basically the Office E3 license, the EMS E3 license, and the Windows E3 license. Okay? So it's packages of packages, which is why licensing is a very long and interesting conversation. And I'll have them with my customers, and we'll finish talking, and they're like, can you do that again, please? Okay. How does that work? And what do I get with that? Okay. But once I've given the user the license that I've purchased, I can then make use of those services. Okay. So the stuff I'm going to talk about today, mainly this afternoon session on compliance, okay, I'm going to need the E3, for some of it, the E5 license. Okay. So some of it won't work in the small business or the scenarios, which the E1 licenses or the small business, the Microsoft Business licenses, because they don't come with the compliance feature set. Okay. Some of the stuff we'll talk about now with regards to security, specifically MFA and conditional access. Conditional access to give me MFA requires Azure Active Directory Premium licenses, but I don't get an Azure Active Directory Premium license by default. I just get an Azure Active Directory Basic license by default. But generally speaking, a lot we're going to talk about today, this first session anyway, just works for us. Okay. I talked about Exchange in that scenario. Exchange ties itself very well into AD. Let's have, what color have we not? I'll use red again. Okay. So there's a whole bunch of attributes that Exchange writes to my user account in AD. So I've got Exchange on-prem, loads and loads of attributes get written. Links very similar as well. Actually, there's not so many attributes, but a bunch of them. Okay. Azure Active Directory Connect copies my attributes up to the cloud. Okay. So the cloud knows that I have an on-prem mailbox because the attributes that exist, things like where my database is and the server it's located on and other stuff like that. Mainly it's an attribute called the Exchange GUID. But there's these attributes copied to the cloud therefore knows I have an Exchange Online mailbox. So if I license a user for Exchange Online, I have Exchange on-premise mailbox. If I license a user for Exchange Online, they won't get an Exchange Online mailbox because Sync says they've got an Exchange mailbox on-premise. Okay. But that concept doesn't exist for Teams because there isn't a Teams server solution, for example. Okay. So I can give a person a Teams license. They can do Teams. I give them an Exchange Online license, but they might not get a mailbox. But that allows me to migrate their mailbox, and then they do get a mailbox. Some of our compliance stuff this afternoon, that will become important in. Okay, so I mentioned it here. Okay. with our duplicate user, remember we created Bill in 2 places. If I create Bill in 2 places, so I'm not syncing Bill in AD, I've gone and created a Bill up in the cloud, okay, and I give them an Exchange Online license, they'll get a mailbox. Because there's nothing saying they have an Exchange mailbox on-prem, because they're not an on-prem user. Okay. Now I create Bill on-prem and give them a mailbox on-prem. Now I try and move their mailbox. That doesn't work. So there's a good awareness, especially for Exchange, of where my attributes are, what they say, and what that means. But for Teams, again, no Teams server, so that's never an issue with giving someone something for Teams. It matters a bit for Link. Okay? But when you move to Skype for Business in the cloud, Skype server to Skype for Business in the cloud, and then move to Teams, and there's other sessions that will talk about that. Okay? So that takes me to a piece where we've just done a review of where all my users could be. We've looked a little bit about licensing and how important it is to have a license, and that's a cloud attribute that I need to set. Okay? I also, if I have Azure Active Directory, actually no, I get it now with an E3 license. If I've got an Office license, I can do this. Okay? I can do group-based licensing. Okay? So I can create a group on-prem, let's call it G, circle it, there we go. It's my group on-prem. That gets synced up to the cloud, okay? And then I can assign a license to the group. Now I add people to the group on-prem. Again, an on-prem group is read-write on-prem. It's read-only in the cloud. But I could take Bill and add them to the group. I could take Mary and add them to the group. When that change of group syncs, they'll get a license assigned to them. So I can do license administration relatively easily. There's a whole bunch of caveats like what happens if I belong to 2 groups, one which gives SharePoint Plan 1 and one which gives SharePoint Plan 2. That doesn't work. But if you have a more simple solution for your licensing, it's a great way of managing licensing, certainly things like a baseline license. I've got a number of customers who are like, Exchange Online, E3 today has, let's say, E3 in February had 15 things in it. E3 today has 17 things in it. What are we going to do given the service desk has never heard of half of them? You know, how do we support these cloud solutions? Okay. And so a number of my customers will do a baseline. They'll get a group, they'll put the people into the group, they'll give some components of the license. So for example, let's pick on Sway, because I haven't picked on that yet today. They decide that, well, we're not going to support Sway, so we're not going to license it for people. Okay. We don't yet do Teams, so let's not license Teams. Okay. Now, Microsoft know this happens, okay, and so their general tendency is they release a new product, they turn it on. Okay. They don't tend to, well, they used to 5 or 6 years ago, release stuff turned off. The problem they found was no one used it. So you're a developer, you've worked for 2 weeks writing this new cloud app, okay, and I know examples of where people have joined Microsoft and within a week have had stuff live in the cloud. So that they don't spend a long time developing. Yes, they do spend a long time developing, but some of the stuff they develop very quickly. And the default license is not to show, so you've done all this hard work, and your feature's not used by anybody. Okay? So the way Microsoft work at the moment is it gets turned on. So when Teams was released a number of years ago, Teams was available. It's only more recently that Teams was tied to a license, and I could take the license off people to stop them using it. Okay. So at the point where we are at the moment, if I don't have a Teams license, I can't use Teams. But if I do have a Teams license, therefore I can. But there was a scenario in the past where I didn't need a Teams license and I could use it. So you can do very much the impact of shadow IT. You know, so there could be people in your organization who've been using Teams, and now you come along and go, right, we've been on that 2-day course. Let's think about how we're going to do this well. We haven't got any compliance rules. We haven't got this. We haven't got that. Let's stop the Teams deployment for a bit and unlicense everybody. And suddenly people are like, oh, hang on. Critical business stuff's gone wrong. We've been using it for 2 years or whatever. Okay. And so you need to be very careful with what you take away from here, with what you learn new from here, because people, your users, may well have been using it for a while, and vice versa. It's a great tendency of IT departments to be very controlling. Modern work space, modern work environments, The idea is to be less controlling, but still to be secure. And so that's what we need to look at, rather than just going, we don't like that, let's stop it. Okay? Let's not do Sway because the IT department don't understand it. Well, let's do Sway. Here's a Google search. Okay? I'll help you if it really doesn't work, but if you're just asking me questions, there's another place to go where we have services we'll offer and services we won't support. That doesn't really work when you get to Teams, though, because it's such a pervasive, all-encompassing application that you can't really say, well, we're not going to do Teams because, or whatever. Okay. So we've got our users. We've synced our users to the cloud. We've given them licenses. Okay. User needs to log in. How is the user going to access all these services that they've got, that we've given them? Okay. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is a little bit of authentication history, and then we're going to talk about what's available to us today. Okay. So I've got the ability, I've got a user in the cloud, I've got the ability to log in as that user in the cloud. Okay. Of course, I've had the ability to log in as the user on-prem from whenever I built my AD environment and joined my workstations to it. I can log into my AD on-prem. Okay. And sync matters for this. How do I actually log in as that user in the cloud? Okay. So if we go back 11 or so years when Office 365 first turned up, and I say that to people and they're like, really? That long ago? Time flies, doesn't it? We go back to when Office 365 first came out. There was two options for authenticating in the cloud. Okay. I could have a cloud user, and I could give them their own password. No. What was that about notifications not popping up in the middle of presentations? Lost it. Where's it gone? That one. There we go. I do have Do Not Disturb on, so it would be quite nice to not to happen. Okay. Yes. So when the cloud first came out, I could have an account in the cloud, and I would have a password. That's right, PWD up there. I'd have a password for that account in the cloud. Okay? Or I could implement Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS. And on-prem, I'd build an ADFS box, and I'd allow the user to log in via ADFS. Okay. Now, ADFS becomes key infrastructure. If that's unavailable, I can't log into the cloud. So, well, I might go and make a couple of ADFS boxes, and then stick them behind a load balancer, and then go, okay, well, I need to log in when on-prem, that's fine. So my on-prem workstations can reach ADFS, but my mobile devices that are out in the big bad internet, they can't reach ADFS. So I need an ADFS proxy. So I have a WAP server, Web Application Proxy, which is my ADFS proxy. And, well, I need a load balancer for that. And I need a few of those in case it fails. And maybe I need some of those in another site in case I have site failure. And it's getting silly, okay? Especially as a lot of the first moves to the cloud, well, let's get rid of this complex beast called Exchange Online, which I might have had 1 or 2 boxes and lots of disks. And the consultant comes up and, fine, let's get rid of Exchange, but you can't really do that, but that's another conversation. And let's implement all this so we can do your login. And so companies have these boxes sitting there. They really don't know what they do until the certificate expires every year, and then they panic. Okay? But that's the other way of doing authentication. Okay? And so the way that would work is I have my user on my device. There's my keyboard. Let's make sure I can see the cloud in this. Okay? And this predates Teams as well. But I connect up to my cloud service. Let's call it Exchange Online for simplicity. Okay? And Exchange Online was doing old, basic, or legacy authentication methods. Okay? So I would pass my password up to Exchange Online. Exchange Online would take my password and pass it to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory would go, contoso.com, that's ADFS. So Azure Active Directory would pass the password down, no, that's wrong. Would pass the password down to ADFS via WAP, because it's out on the big bad internet. WAP would pass the password request into ADFS, and ADFS would pass it into AD, and AD would go, yes, that password's correct. All this over SSL, okay? But it's still passing the password around. Okay. The alternative to all this was a thing called password hash sync. I could take the DIR-sync of the time, the AD Connect of the time, and I could sync my password up to the cloud, and I'd have Azure Active Directory do it. Okay, so the same process works. I'd hit Exchange Online. It would go, I don't know who you are. You're anonymous. It would go to Azure Active Directory and pass the password to Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory would go yes or no, because Azure Active Directory had a copy of your password, and it would let you in. Or with ADFS, a few more steps, we're logged in, and Azure Active Directory passes back a token to Azure AD. Azure AD passes back a token to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online says yes. And all this is our legacy auth. All I need is a username and password. Roll forward a number of years, and Microsoft introduced modern authentication. It's OAuth. It was invented by Twitter and a couple of other organizations. Microsoft call it modern auth. It's the same thing. Okay. If I have ADFS, I could implement OAuth. Okay, I turn it on in the cloud. Microsoft decided to turn it on for new tenants from August 2017 and onward, but not turn it on for old tenants. Although in the last couple of months, they've decided to turn it on for old tenants. Okay. So you could well be in a mix of having modern auth enabled for some services like Teams, because it's only ever modern auth, and not be modern auth for other services like Exchange Online and SharePoint and Skype. Okay, SharePoint was always modern auth. Browser-based stuff was always modern auth. And the way modern auth worked was I would connect up to my service. My service would, I don't know who you are, please go to Azure AD. So notice the difference in the way authentication flows work. The first one was I pass my password in clear text over an SSL session, but it's still in clear text, to the service, and the service would log me on for me. But with modern auth, I hit the service goes, I don't know who you are. It would send back a redirect. There's a browser-based technology. It would send back a redirect. I'd be redirected to Azure AD. Now, if I've got my password stored up in the cloud is doing my authentication for me, I'm now authenticated. If I'm still using ADFS, I would now be redirected. This diagram is going to get very messy. I would get redirected to ADFS. ADFS goes to AD. AD says yes. Back to AD, pass the token that I've been given that says yes, you can log in. ADFS says you're good. I pass that back up to Azure AD, which understands the token and says, Azure AD says good because ADFS says good. I pass that back down, I pass that up to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online says, yay, you're in, here's your mailbox. Okay? And if you do that in a browser, you can see it all happening in the address bar, okay? Or you open up Fiddler or things like that, and you can watch it happening. It's a great way of learning what's going on in these scenarios. But it's still a whole bunch of servers and complexity, all for the idea that I don't want to keep, or I don't want to tell the cloud my password. When in fact, that's what I did in the first place anyway, with legacy auth. I told the cloud my password via a different route anyway. So over the last couple of years, some new technologies have become available to us. Okay? We do them via Azure Active Directory Connect, so we use the Azure Active Directory Connect service and box to turn them on. Okay? The first one is still password hash sync. Okay? So it takes my password from AD. It generates a unique salt for it to uniquely encrypt it. It encrypts it 1,000 times with the same key, and then sends the 1,000-time password hash sync, which is really what it should be called, rather than just password hash sync. It should be password hash sync encrypted 1,000 times with a unique salt up to the cloud. And the cloud has this unique blob of data that they can't reverse. When I connect to the cloud to authenticate in a password hash sync scenario, I will pass my password, again in clear text, but over an SSL channel. Microsoft will take the clear text password that they see. They will hash it 1,000 times, and they'll compare the two hashes and go, yes, you must have typed in that password correctly in the first place, because if you didn't type in the password correctly in the first place, it wouldn't have generated the same hash. Therefore, you couldn't have, you must have got the password right. An advantage to that, a very subtle advantage to that, is Microsoft see all the bad password attempts we make. Okay? They also see all the bad password attempts the hackers make as well. So they have a very good idea of what passwords are not good to be using today, like summer 2019 exclamation mark with a capital S, And we all know that's secure because our IT department have told us you need complex passwords for the last 15 years. Okay? And a complex password needs to have upper, lower, number, and a symbol, or 3 of those. And so the user goes, summer 2019, exclamation mark. Yes, I've done what the IT department say. Okay? Or indeed, the IT department go, Tuesday 2019, exclamation mark. Hello, welcome to the company. Here's your new password. Who does that? Who has very complex and good long passwords for their users when they start? Nobody does. Because all they're going to do is answer support calls all the time when the user's forgotten their password. Right. We've got the ability with Azure Active Directory, if you've got the P1 license now, to download a list from Microsoft of Microsoft's well-known passwords. You can't read it. They don't let you actually read it. But they can download it, and you can place it on your domain controllers, and you can stop users having Control-Alt-Delete, set my password on-prem, to a common password in the cloud. That's an Azure AD feature. And it's nothing to do with Teams, but if I can secure my users' identities on-prem, that benefits me for the use of cloud services like Teams. Okay. So that's password hash sync, many times encrypted and synced to the cloud. The alternative option that I've got, I can still do ADFS, but without the complexity. The alternative option I've got, let's go bright yellow, is in my Azure Active Directory Connect, I can make let's make that a nice thick line. I can have a connection up to Azure AD, and I keep that connection open. It's a TCP connection over 443. I keep it open. My firewalls don't like that. They close it, so I open it again. But the idea is I keep that connection open. And then when the user authenticates to the cloud, so in comes the user's connection to the cloud. So this is yellow as well. The connection comes into the cloud. The cloud passes it down the open connection. No inbound firewall rules required. No need to talk to the security team. Hello, security team, I'd like you. No. Do you not listen? No. You want to open a port? We don't do that here at this company. Okay? And so we don't need to do that. We don't need to talk to the firewall team, or indeed, apologies if you're the firewall team. Who's ever phoned the firewall team and said, can I have this, please? And 3 weeks later, they come back with something different. Okay? And no, that's not what I asked for. Okay? That's very common. Okay? I don't need it in this scenario. As long as I've got 443 outbound, and everybody gives everybody 443 outbound, don't they? Unfortunately, but there you go. 443 outbound to the cloud. When I try and authenticate to the cloud sends my authentication request down the open connection. Azure Active Directory Connect sends it to AD. AD says yes, and we pass it back. The cloud hasn't done my authentication. I don't need to sync my password to the cloud if I don't want to. I've got a couple of government clients, and government paperwork from 5 years ago said you can't do password hash sync solutions. Government paperwork from this year says they can. Maybe it was last year now. But from 5 years ago, absolutely no, you can't do that. And so I got government clients that are all ADFS because they weren't syncing their password. Well, this option here allows me to not sync the password hash sync as well, but to have it come back in. Okay. And for fault tolerance, I just stick a connector on another server and open that up as well. And I can have maybe 3 or 4 servers running this very lightweight agent connecting to the cloud, and it will just load balance across them. Okay. And so I can do my authentication to AD, but get given the tokens that say, if Azure AD says, so Azure AD gets authenticated, Azure AD then issues the token for the service I want. So in the case of Teams, I hit Azure AD passes it through to on-prem. On-prem says, great. Azure AD issues me, it's called a refresh token. A refresh token has a lifespan of 90 days by default. Okay? And as long as I keep refreshing it within 14 days, it stays active. Okay? And then for the service I want access to, Teams, in this case, I get given an access token. So I have my refresh token, I have my access token. My access token lasts 1 hour, but my access token is unique for Teams. You know, if I want to open up OneDrive for business, for example, well, I've got my refresh token, because let's say I opened up Teams, I got a refresh token, I got an access token for Teams. Now I want to open up OneDrive for business. I go back to Azure AD and say, here's my refresh token, and it goes, fine, here's an access token for OneDrive. So I've got my same refresh token, and I've got 2 access tokens. one for Teams, one for OneDrive. Okay. And that process keeps going. Those access tokens last for an hour. But important there, once I got this refresh token, I don't come back to AD to check the user anymore. Okay. In theory, I don't come back to AD for another 90 days, because that refresh token is valid for 90 days. Okay. Now, if I disable the account on-prem, and I sync that disable up to the cloud, that will revoke my refresh token. So within the hour, because sometime within the hour I'll go back once the access token expires, and I'll go and get another access token. At that point, my access token has expired, because it's an hour old. I come back with my refresh token and say, can I have an access token for Teams, please? Here's my valid refresh token. And Azure AD goes, oh, no, it's not. Your account has expired. Sorry, not expired. Your account has been disabled. Your refresh token is no longer valid. Okay. If I change my password on-prem, same behavior. I change my password on-prem, that makes my refresh token invalid. Okay. But otherwise, that refresh token is valid for 90 days, and it keeps getting renewed. Okay. If we look at that scenario in a little bit more detail, I got my refresh token.